I realized something was deeply wrong when I received a call from an escrow agent confirming the successful closing of my father's property sale. I froze mid-step in the hospital corridor, the stethoscope still hanging around my neck, and the voice on the other end chirping. Just calling to confirm Mr. Felix Torres has received the wire. Wonderful working with you all. My father's house, our family home in Upper Montclair, was supposed to be in a revocable trust under my name pending his full recovery from the stroke. I never authorized a sale, and he certainly couldn't have, either, not while lying in a semi-vegetative state for the past 3 months in long-term care. I asked the agent to repeat what she just said. She mentioned a closing date. 7 weeks ago. Buyer, Elderbridge LLC. Sale price, $1,400,000, 0 cents. Seller signature, Felix Torres. I didn't scream, I didn't accuse, I simply asked for a copy of the documents. After the shift, I sat in the break room with trembling hands and opened the PDF on my phone. There it was. His name, his shaky signature, notarized. A 204-page file full of legal formalities and one overwhelming fraud. I compared it against a medical intake form he had signed before his stroke. The signature on the deed was close, but not close enough. The loops, the slant, the hesitations. They didn't match. I tried calling my sister Isabel straight to voicemail. I drove to the house hoping naively that some clerical mistake had happened, but it was already too late. The place was empty, the porch light was gone, the familiar white curtains had been replaced. A lockbox sat on the front door. Inside me, something ruptured. But it wasn't rage, it was resolve. As a physician, I'd seen too many patients exploited during moments of vulnerability, but I never thought it would happen to us. And I never imagined the person responsible would be my own sister. Isabel wasn't just my sister. For most of my life, she was my second half. We were only 4 years apart, raised by a single father who worked double shifts at the postal office to keep food on the table. Our mother died when I was 11 and Isabel 7. From that point on, we learned to depend on each other like soldiers in the same trench. She was the dreamer, I was the doer. She played piano, painted, wanted to be a teacher. I volunteered at the hospital and high school and never looked back. When I went into the Army to pay for med school, she stayed behind to take care of Dad. She eventually married a dentist, settled into suburban life, and taught elementary school for nearly a decade. I sent money home every month. It was never discussed. It was just what big sisters did. But things changed after her divorce. She stopped teaching, said it was burnout, started relying more on Dad's accounts than I was comfortable with, but I didn't push. When Dad's health declined last year, I was in the middle of covering night shifts at St. Matthew's. She offered to step in as his full-time caregiver. I agreed, relieved and grateful. She moved into his house and took over everything. Groceries, appointments, medications, bills. I trusted her completely. It never even crossed my mind to question the decisions she was making. Looking back now, the signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. She grew evasive on phone calls. She stopped sending me updates about Dad's condition unless I explicitly asked. And when I tried to set up a Zoom call so I could see him face to face, she said the Wi-Fi in the house was spotty, or that he was too tired, or that I'd just upset him. I chalked it up to stress. Caregiving isn't easy, I knew that. I defended her when our cousin made a comment about how Isabel was awfully comfortable in that house. But in hindsight, her sudden fixation on power of attorney, paperwork, her insistence on handling Dad's taxes, her refusal to give me online access to the household account, those weren't acts of responsibility. They were rehearsals. She knew I'd be too busy, too emotionally invested, too loyal to suspect anything, and she was right. Until now. But what she didn't know was that my career had taught me to recognize patterns, to see through timelines that didn't line up, to read between the lines of lab reports and human behavior. She may have counted on my love, but she underestimated my training. What Isabel didn't realize was that I'd never stopped being cautious. Maybe it was my time in the Army, or the years spent filing clinical incident reports and navigating malpractice insurance fine print, but I learned early that people weren't always who they said they were, even the ones you loved, especially them. When Dad suffered his first minor stroke last winter, I'd quietly hired an elder law attorney just to make sure all his documents were properly recorded. At the time, Isabel was cooperative. She signed off on a shared medical power of attorney. I kept a notarized copy of the original will in my safe deposit box at Garden State Federal. The will named both of us as beneficiaries, with me as trustee. I'd also insisted, much to Isabel's irritation, that all major financial transactions required dual consent. It was a formality, really. I never imagined she'd try to override it. Now, I was grateful for every bit of paranoia I'd tucked into place. I pulled out the scanned will from my encrypted email archives, comparing it to the new version I'd just been sent by the escrow office. The differences were subtle, but damning. In the old version, the Montclair house couldn't be sold without my co-signature. In the new version, Isabel had sole authority, supposedly granted after I'd abdicated financial responsibility. A lie. There was no such amendment on record with our attorney. She'd forged it, or convinced someone else to create it. I started building a digital folder labeled ISIL fraud and dropped in every PDF, screenshot, and time-stamped email I could find. I cross-referenced my father's ICU admission records with the property deed date. I took note of the notary's name on the fake document. Then I reached out to 2 people I knew I could trust. Marla Singh, a colleague from med school turned elder law attorney in Newark, and Dr. Lee, a forensic psychiatrist who'd testified in several abuse cases I'd referred over the years. I didn't tell them everything yet, just enough to signal what I was up against, because this wasn't going to be a shouting match at a kitchen table. This was going to be a case, with evidence, procedure, and pressure. "I don't start fights," I muttered aloud as I stared at the spreadsheet of Isabel's recent transfers from Dad's bank account. But I finished them, and I was just getting started. The next morning, I walked into St. Matthew's, logged into the EMR system, and downloaded every chart note, admission timestamp, and neuroevaluation related to my father's stroke. On paper, he was admitted to the ICU at 3:47 p.m. on March 2nd. Nonverbal, left-sided hemiparesis, GCS score of 7. He was intubated within the hour. The fake deed was notarized on March 5th. There was no way he'd been coherent enough to read, let alone sign, a legal document. "You don't think I tried to rape John?" The attending neurologist's progress note on that date specifically stated minimal responsiveness to verbal stimuli. It was irrefutable. Next, I called the title company that handled the property transfer. I posed as myself, no deception, just a quiet voice and precise questions. The agent was cooperative, possibly sensing something was off. She confirmed that the seller had signed in person, with a notary provided by a mobile service. The name on the notary's stamp? Angela L. Marks. I wrote it down. Then I pulled my father's Chase checking account history from his secure portal. I had never deactivated my access. The password hadn't changed. I printed the full transaction history for February through April, and that's when the stomach drop hit. There were over 20 transfers made during his hospitalization, some as large as $8,000, 0 cents, routed to an entity labeled EB Realty Partner. The memo lines were vague: consulting, property review, management fees, all initiated from an IP address in Montclair. Isabel's address. I saved everything, screenshotted the metadata, time-stamped the paper trail. At home that night, I opened a bottle of seltzer and sat in the dark with just my laptop screen glowing. My hands moved automatically, not as a daughter but as a professional trained to document, cross-check, verify. I knew grief. I'd walked families through it for years, but betrayal? Betrayal was different. It didn't make you cry. It made you cold. I wasn't sure yet how deep it went, but I had enough to know this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a single bad decision. It was calculated. And it wasn't just my family at risk. I spent the weekend treating my father's case like a clinical mystery. Every hour not spent at the hospital was devoted to spreadsheets, document scans, and digital cross-referencing. I mapped Isabel's transfer dates against Dad's medication logs and daily progress notes. On half those days, he'd been on heavy sedation. The idea that he could approve or even understand a financial transaction was laughable. I'd pulled public records on EB Realty Partners. They had no website, no listed employees, just a P.O. box in Hackensack and a generic Gmail contact. But the LLC had been involved in 6 property acquisitions in northern New Jersey in the past 2 years, all involving elderly owners, all sold well below market value, all tied to the same notary, Angela L. Marks. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a pattern. I highlighted every address in yellow on a regional map and noticed something else. 4 of the 6 properties were within a 5-mile radius. Same neighborhood as my dad's house. These weren't random flips, they were targeting people in a specific demographic, in a specific zip code. Using my hospital credentials, I accessed the database of recent social service referrals tied to elder neglect or medical guardianship cases. 3 names popped up with overlapping features: advanced age, no active family members listed in the care plan, and, most chillingly, documentation signed under questionable circumstances. I knew what I was looking at now. This wasn't about my sister needing money, this was a machine, a quiet, profitable machine that had been running unnoticed beneath the surface of suburban decency. Isabel had simply plugged herself into it. Maybe she thought no one would care. That I wouldn't notice. That I'd be too loyal, too busy, or too far removed to act. But what she forgot is that pattern recognition is what I do for a living, diagnosing complicated systems, spotting what doesn't belong. And this? None of this belonged. So I began compiling the case, patiently, methodically, like I was preparing to scrub in for surgery, because the first rule of medicine and of justice is simple: do no harm. But the second, find what's broken and cut it out. On Monday morning, I took a personal day, not to rest. I had other plans. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, I walked into the Newark office of Marla Singh, my old med school classmate turned elder law specialist. We hadn't seen each other in years, but I didn't need small talk. I needed someone who could help me understand exactly what I was dealing with, legally, financially, and tactically. Marla listened in silence as I laid out everything: the forged documents, the bank transfers, the timeline of Dad's incapacity. When I pulled out the map of other elderly sellers connected to the same LLC and notary, her brows drew together. "This is bigger than family," she said flatly. "This smells like organized exploitation under the guise of guardianship and real estate transfer. We've seen a rise in this across the state, usually quiet, underreported, often legal on the surface, but what you have here, this is surgical." That word stuck with me. Surgical. Together, we reviewed the relevant statutes. The New Jersey Elder Financial Exploitation Protection Act gave us leverage, but only if we moved through proper channels. Marla warned me against emotional retaliation or private confrontations. We needed procedure, formality, pressure through the system, not around it. We drafted a complaint package: notarized statement from me, printouts of all financial transactions, hospital reports proving mental incapacity, and copies of both the real and forged wills. She also introduced me to Victor Alvarez, a former state investigator now working in private practice. He'd helped uncover a similar fraud ring targeting Korean elders in Bergen County. Victor agreed to take the case. Quietly, for now. He recommended we install a soft watch on Isabel's current communications and trace her contact with EB Realty's shell accounts. He would also look into Angela Marks, the notary, and whether her credentials were real or forged. Marla had one final recommendation: freeze all remaining assets connected to Dad, even if it meant temporarily locking myself out too. "Build your case like you're treating sepsis," she said. "Control the source. Don't let it spread." That night, I moved $84,000 in remaining funds from Dad's joint account into a secured legal trust under court supervision. Not out of spite, not even revenge. This was containment. And Isabel wasn't the only infection. 3 days later, Victor called me. "You were right," he said, skipping any greeting, "and you're not the only one." His voice was low, tense, focused. Angela L. Marks, the notary listed on Dad's property sale, had her license revoked 2 years ago for fraudulent notarization in Essex County. But somehow she'd continued notarizing documents under an expired commission. Her stamp had shown up on 11 separate property transfers in the past 16 months, all involving elderly owners, all sold below market value, all funneled through either EB Realty Partners or a related shell LLC called Silvergate Holdings. Victor dug deeper. Turns out both EB and Silvergate were managed on paper by a man named Todd Riley, who just happened to be a suspended real estate attorney out of Hoboken, disbarred for ethical violations 5 years earlier. Todd had since built an off-the-record consulting network of family members and acquaintances who acted as scouts, looking for vulnerable homeowners in health crises or cognitive decline. Isabel fit the pattern perfectly. A family insider, access to documents, familiar with the household rhythms, able to feign concern while slowly redirecting financial control. I felt nauseous. Not because of Isabel's role, I'd already mourned that relationship, but because of how deliberate it all was. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't misguided. She was recruited. Victor's contact at the state licensing board quietly confirmed that 2 other notaries associated with these deals were also under investigation. One had fled the state, another had lawyered up. We now had confirmed evidence of a systematic operation, forged or coerced signatures, notarized by illegitimate officers, facilitated by licensed professionals who'd long slipped beneath the radar. And worse, there were more victims. Victor had already identified at least 4 families in nearby counties with eerily similar stories. The common denominator? Elderly parents, adult children who suddenly took over, and properties that disappeared into shell LLCs within weeks. I sat with that for a long time. This wasn't a betrayal. This was a business model, and for every person like me, trained, connected, and relentless, there were dozens who wouldn't know where to begin. That had to change. By the following Monday, the case file was 142 pages long. I printed it twice, 1 copy for my attorney, 1 for the New Jersey office of the Public Guardian, the agency tasked with investigating elder abuse and fiduciary misconduct. I walked it into their Trenton office myself, dressed in navy blue scrubs and a white coat, still wearing my hospital badge, let them see who they were dealing with. The intake officer, a quiet woman named Nadine, flipped through the first few pages and looked up at me slowly. "You gathered all this on your own?" I nodded. "With legal oversight and a licensed investigator." She asked me to wait. 10 minutes later, a supervisor joined us. 20 minutes after that, we were in a back office, reviewing the material with 2 compliance attorneys and an internal fraud analyst. I laid it all out, the medical timeline proving my father's incapacity, the bank transfers executed from Isabel's home IP address, the notarizations from a revoked license, the chain of LLCs with cross-ownership between Todd Riley and other suspended professionals, and the victims Victor had identified. They didn't say much, but I could see it in their posture. This wasn't just compelling, it was actionable. They opened an internal investigation immediately. Victor provided sworn affidavits. Marla filed a civil injunction to freeze any remaining assets tied to Elderbridge, Silvergate, or Isabel Torres. The state initiated a temporary hold on property transfers involving either LLC pending review. By Thursday, we were contacted by the Division of Consumer Affairs, who began reviewing Isabel's communications under the suspicion of coordinated fraud. Their digital forensics unit confirmed what we suspected. She'd been receiving encrypted instructions from a Gmail address linked to Todd Riley's firm. That same day, I filed a formal complaint with the Essex County Prosecutor's Office. Charges requested: financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraudulent conveyance of property, conspiracy to commit elder fraud, and obstruction of legal guardianship. They didn't laugh me out of the room. They assigned a case number. That night, I sat alone in the hospital chapel after rounds. I didn't pray for punishment. I prayed for every patient I'd ever seen whose story ended with someone taking what wasn't theirs, while no one noticed or cared or knew how to fight back. And this time, someone had noticed. By the end of the week, surveillance was in place. Victor had secured a court-sanctioned digital trace on Isabel's outgoing communications. Using metadata from her laptop's email headers and shared cloud accounts, We watched as she uploaded PDFs of additional financial records to a shared drive with a masked user tagged TR Consulting. Todd Riley, hiding in plain sight. On Friday, Victor called me in the middle of clinic hours. "They're moving," he said. "We have a live attempt." That morning, Isabel had tried to transfer the remaining $84,000, 0 cents, still frozen in legal trust, by submitting forged documentation to the probate clerk's office claiming emergency hardship. Her request was flagged immediately. She'd claimed that our father had regained capacity and personally asked her to reclaim the funds. The problem? I'd just finished adjusting his feeding tube. He hadn't spoken in weeks. We now had direct proof of active intent to defraud a court. At Victor's suggestion, I agreed to one more step: a recorded phone call. I texted Isabel, telling her we needed to talk this out privately. She called back within 10 minutes. My voice shook only slightly as I asked why she had sold the house without me. She didn't deny it. Instead, she sighed and said, "I thought you wouldn't care. You're always at the hospital. You were never really present for him." Then she added almost bitterly, "I deserved something back." She didn't know the line was being recorded, or that Victor and Marla were listening in live. That call was enough to solidify probable cause. The next day, Victor's tech team traced a transaction request, scheduled for Monday morning, attempting to shift funds from EB Realty to a new Delaware-based entity called Oakward Capital Holdings. Same pattern, same shell game, only this time the state was watching. At 5:42 a.m. Monday, investigators served simultaneous subpoenas to Isabel's residence and Todd Riley's office. Devices were seized, hard drives cloned, digital trails secured. Isabel tried to deny everything. Then she lawyered up. Then she went silent. But the damage was already done. The network had been caught mid-move. And there's something unique about catching people in motion. They can't pretend they were just standing still. Within 2 weeks, the headlines broke. Real estate fraud ring preyed on elderly in Montclair, Newark, and Bergen County. 3 arrested. Isabel's mugshot didn't appear at first. The DA's office initially withheld her identity while charges were being formalized, but it didn't take long. Once the press got hold of the indictment filings, her name and her role were public. She was formally charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery conspiracy to defraud, obstruction of legal guardianship. Todd Riley faced a heavier stack: wire fraud, identity falsification, unlawful practice of law, and racketeering. His consulting network unraveled fast. 3 other participants took plea deals in exchange for testimony. The notary, Angela Marks, was arrested in Pennsylvania and extradited to face felony charges. More importantly, victims began to come forward. A man in Union City discovered his late mother's home had been transferred 6 months before her passing, without her ever signing a document. A widow in Bergenfield wept as she testified that her brother-in-law had used similar tactics under Riley's direction. The network wasn't just real, it was bigger than we'd thought. Regulators reacted swiftly. The New Jersey State Notary Board overhauled its licensing verification process. The Office of Public Guardian launched a joint task force with the Division of Consumer Affairs focused on elder financial abuse. Hospitals, including mine, adopted new protocols requiring direct witness documentation for financial authorizations from incapacitated patients. Professionally, I kept my head down. I didn't speak to reporters, I didn't join the public outrage, but I answered every call from investigators. I provided testimony in 2 depositions. I shared what I'd learned with hospital administration and social workers. And every night, when I looked at my father sleeping peacefully in his assisted living room, I reminded myself, this wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. It was about sending a message. If you target someone when they're most vulnerable, you may get away with it for a while, but eventually, someone will notice, and someone trained to notice will act. Isabel accepted a plea deal: 3 years of probation, full financial restitution to her father's trust, and mandatory psychological evaluation as part of a state-supervised accountability program. She stood in front of a judge and admitted, publicly, that she had forged documents, misused fiduciary authority, and knowingly participated in a scheme that defrauded her own family. I was there, seated quietly in the second row of the courtroom. She never looked at me. The judge called her actions calculated, prolonged, and profoundly unethical. Yet, because it was her first offense, and because the funds had been frozen before being spent, the court opted for rehabilitation over incarceration. I didn't object. I wasn't interested in vengeance. I didn't need orange jumpsuits or shackles to feel closure. What I needed was to see the truth spoken, on record, with no more denials or justifications. Elderbridge and Silvergate were dissolved by court order, all assets seized. Todd Riley was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Angela Marks lost her license permanently. Her plea deal included cooperation in identifying others still operating under fake credentials. As for me, I was cleared to resume full control over my father's estate. The property was unrecoverable. It had been resold to a third party. But the court ordered a financial settlement equivalent to its appraised market value, paid through Riley's forfeiture fund. The money wasn't the point. It never was. But when the final wire cleared into Dad's trust account, I sat by his bed, took his hand, and said softly, "It's done. You're safe now." He didn't answer, his mind still lost in neurological fog, but his grip tightened, and that was enough. A year later, I gave a lecture to a group of new residents about medical ethics and patient advocacy. At the end, someone asked, "Have you ever had to step in when the system failed someone?" I paused. Then I told them this story, not in full, but enough to make the point that harm doesn't always wear a stranger's face, that sometimes those closest to us can do the quietest damage, and that professional integrity isn't just for hospital charts. It's for everything. Since then, I've joined a state advisory board on elder protections. I review policy drafts, help train social workers on red flags, and push for legislation that requires financial consent audits for patients under cognitive care. My father still doesn't understand what happened, and maybe that's a gift. His days are quiet now, filled with sunlight and slow music, and nurses who call him Mr. T. As for Isabel, we haven't spoken. I don't need to reconcile to move on. Justice didn't restore what we lost, but it stopped the bleeding, and sometimes that's how healing begins.